Great. Well, thank you all very much for your patience. I've got a military background. I'm fully demobilised now. Once upon a time, I'd have been dreadfully embarrassed about this, but by Oxford standards, we're positively early. Welcome to the Blavatnik School of Government. It's a great pleasure to be able to welcome you all here. My name is Tom Simpson, and I'm an Associate Professor of Philosophy and Public Policy here. And it's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker tonight, Alexander Hug. Alexander is the Principal Deputy Chief Monitor for the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine. He's a trained lawyer and served as an officer in the Swiss Army, including a stint as Regional Commander of the Swiss Headquarters Support Unit for the OSCE in northern Bosnia and Herzegovina. He's also worked for the OSCE mission in Kosovo, the temporary international presence in Hebron, and the EU Rule of Law mission in Kosovo. And he's come to join us tonight to speak about the OSCE's mission in Ukraine, its history, how that mission has evolved over the past 4 years, and what the challenges are that it faces as we come up. So in just a minute, I'll invite him up. The format will be he'll speak for about 15, maybe 20 minutes, and then we'll go into open questions and discussion, and we'll finish no later than 7 o'clock. And just to say, this event is being live streamed, so if you don't want to be broadcast to the world, then please keep your hand down. Great. So, Alexander, it's a real pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to the School of Government here who has made this possible. I'm here together with my colleague Pierre, and the two of us represent 700 monitors that are currently monitoring the situation in Ukraine, not just in the east, but across the country. And on top of those 700 monitors are an additional 400 Ukrainian colleagues that serve along us. But before I go into the details of the mission itself, I wonder who of you has already heard of the OSCE as an organization? And who of those or the others have heard of its field operation in Ukraine, the Special Monitoring Mission? Okay. And who of those read the mission's daily reports daily? Well, you should put your arms up here. The Special Monitoring Mission has been put on the ground, and this is where I would like to start. Before I then explain what it has been doing throughout this year, give you a quick update on the situation on the ground, and then mainly dwell on the challenges, the dilemmas we face as a multilateral organization in an active conflict. And most of the time, I hope, Tom, we can spend then also in a very interactive fashion towards the end of this presentation. Mandate and deployment of the mission to begin with. The Special Monitoring Mission has been set up to do something entirely different than it is doing now. The change in government in Kiev in the winter 2013-14 led to an invitation by the new government for a field operation in Ukraine, approved by a consensus vote of the 57 participating states of the OSCE, to put a mission onto the ground in Ukraine to monitor the adherence of the new government to the OSCE principles, the OSCE commitments. And that was on the 21st of March 2014, before the conflict. Small-scale operation before the conflict, meant to monitor the human dimension principles, for instance, and other dimensions of the OSCE. That is how the center of Kiev looked at the time when we came to Ukraine. Within 24 hours, monitors were dispatched to 10 cities across Ukraine, including the two eastern cities of Donetsk and Luhansk, but also to Kiev, to the south in Odessa, or to the far west in cities like Lviv. Very quickly, however, the situation changed on the ground, and in particular in the east, we have seen that demonstrations erupted. These demonstrators first were on the street, then started to occupy administrative buildings, and the demonstrators in these buildings were then armed with wooden sticks. They turned into metal sticks, turned into sidearms, turned into mortars, turned into artillery systems, turned into multiple launch rocket systems, and the mission found itself very quickly in a full-fledged conflict there. It had to prove its efficiency many times in these early days, apart from adapting itself very quickly to the changing environment, also at the occasion of the downing of the civilian airliners MH17 in the summer of 2013, where, based on its dialogue facilitation mandate, the mission managed to facilitate access to rescue workers to the crash site, which was in the middle of areas that the government at the time did not control. The mission then evolved, continued to monitor the situation on the ground, face constant challenges, security-related, but others, and I will come to that, and ended up now in its 4th year, and the mission's mandate expires by the end of March this year, as it does every year, doing something different than it was set up to. Very briefly, the mandate of the mission has 2 main pillars. One is monitoring and reporting, and the other one is dialogue facilitation. That is the bulk of the mandate given to it before the conflict erupted there. Parallel to that is the Minsk process, where in the summer of 2014, Normandy 4, Germany, France, Ukraine, and the Russian Federation met in Normandy and tried to find a solution, a way out of the conflict, and decided there to establish the trilateral contact group, which also consists of the same participants and 4 working groups to it that deal with specific aspects of the conflict, one related to security issues, one to economic issues, one to humanitarian issues, and one to political issues. The last entity that I would like to introduce to you in the beginning is the Joint Center for Control and Coordination, a bilateral arrangement between Ukraine and the Russian Federation, resulting out of a telephone conversation after the summer 2014 between the 2 presidents, meant to coordinate and control the implementation of these early agreements. Here the date stamps on it, and you can see once again the mission's actual inception was far before the conflict there started. The one connection the 2 have is that the mission contributes to the process by providing objective information and by coordinating one of the 4 working groups there, the one on security issues. But you will be interested to learn that the mandate of the mission does not refer to the Minsk agreements, it does not refer to ceasefire violation monitoring, and it does not refer to observations made specifically in terms of the humanitarian situation on the ground. However, the mandate, that Permanent Council Decision 1117, you can find the document on our website, is broad enough formulated that the task we currently undertake can be brought under this. We have been dispatching, as I mentioned, to 10 locations across Ukraine. You see them here, to the west, to the east, to the south, and to the center. These are the figures at the moment, some 740 internationally seconded monitors, then some 400 Ukrainian staff and another 100 international staff that work for this mission. So a quite big undertaking now in its 4th year. Zooming into the eastern part of the country there where the conflict is still active, you see here green the Donetsk region and brownish there the Luhansk region. Yellow on that map is the contact line dividing government-controlled areas from non-government-controlled areas. The yellow line, approximately 500 kilometers long, extremely long as a contact line. Further to the east, the Russian Federation there, with parts of an unsecure border towards the Russian Federation. 408 kilometers long is that stretch there that at the moment is not controlled by the government. Very briefly, to the various agreements reached, you hear in the media often there is reference made to Minsk I and Minsk II. In fact, there were at least 7 agreements signed in Minsk, and they regulate the following issues in summary. It's the non-use of weapons, or the ceasefire, the disengagement of positions where they stand too close, the withdrawal of heavy weapons, the most indiscriminate weapons they use in the conflict is multiple launch rocket systems, the artillery pieces that are being deployed, and the mine clearance on the ground. Apart from other measures, but these are the initial measures, the military technical measures intended to stabilize the situation. It will quickly see that the adherence to these are not complete. Quickly, the situation in the eastern part of the country, What you see in front of you is a graph of what we had been monitoring and reporting in terms of violations of the ceasefire. In green color, those registered in the Donetsk region, and in yellow, those in the Luhansk region. And you see on a daily basis violation numbered up to 3,000 just before Christmas. And around that date, in Minsk, the sides have agreed to recommit to the ceasefire. And what is very interesting there to note is after that recommitment, the ceasefire numbers dropped to almost zero, only then to grow up again back to the 4-digit numbers where we have them now again. 2017 saw 4 of these recommitments at the occasion of Easter, at the occasion of the harvest season, the beginning of the school year in September, and then here around Christmas, New Year. And every time we have seen the cycle of violence resuming due to the fact that the main and the root causes of the conflict, the technical ones on the ground, the close proximity of the positions of the armed forces and the armed formations, as well as the presence of heavy weapons in areas where there shouldn't be, continue to be there, left unaddressed. And these are the main reasons why the fighting continues, the technical military reasons on the ground. And on the map on the right-hand side, you can see there the intensity of the conflict. The red circles are these so-called hotspots where 90% of the fighting is taking place, all of it in the Donetsk region, and that has one main reason. As in the Luhansk region, in the light blue part of that map, the red line there, the contact line, is made up of a river, the Severodonetsk River, which builds a natural barrier between the sides, a distance where tension cannot build up easily, and where that proximity is not much as a problem as it is, for instance, to the western side, the northern side of Donetsk city, the big city there in the Donetsk region. Very quickly how that looks on the ground. I just show you a few images there, just to illustrate how the situation at the moment does look like. Here you see main battle tanks, too close to the contact line in areas beyond government control. They should be 15 kilometers away from the contact line here, facing the contact line, and of course clearly within those agreed disengagement lines. Here, more of the same. Here, an 122 millimeter mortar howitzer on the government side, camouflage, but also in areas where it shouldn't be. Very well hidden here in the tree line, main battle tanks there too. And another big problem, the mines, the mine infestation in all of the areas along the contact line. And of course, this all has a big impact on the civilian population on the ground. Here you see the civilian casualties, excluding those casualties from the fighting sides. You can see here the main causes of death and injury is shelling, meaning the use of heavy weapons caused that yellow bar there, and mines and unexploded ordnance. And you see here once again, if the sides would have withdrawn their weapons and would have stopped mining and have started to demine, then the majority of the victims, of the civilian victims, could have been prevented. 479 victims in total the mission has been registering last year. Now, a few words on challenges there. On this picture, you see the former international airport in Donetsk, completely destroyed, not any longer usable. All our transport in and out areas beyond government control has to happen in the armored vehicles, as you see them on this slide, which were none in theater on the 21st of March 2014, as the mission was not set up to do that. 7 challenges there, they overlap, and I will go through them one by one now, and this should also be the basis, I hope, Tom, for our debate just after this. Political. The definition of the conflict isn't settled, and you will see later on the sides or the parties to the conflict aren't clear depending to whom you talk. The OSCE Special Monitoring Mission, the OSCE as an organization, is always at risk of being drawn into the equation of the conflict, that the presence, for instance, of the Special Monitoring Mission becomes a condition or a conditionality for the implementation of the agreements. And the presence itself, and you have seen that along the contact line, may be seen by some as cementing division rather than trying to resolve the conflict. The participating states, those 57 states that have agreed in a consensus vote a year ago and now sitting together again back in Vienna to extend that, have also a dilemma at hand, of course, because they have designed a mission that meant to be doing something else that it is doing now. It is an instrument for stabilization and normalization. That is what the preamble says of our mandate. But what exactly do participating states mean and what they want to use this mission for? And the Russian Federation, Ukraine, are just 2 of those 57 participating states that have agreed to put this mission on the ground. It is also very difficult to prove for those participating states as to how they use the tax money to put into this mission. The budget of this mission is over 100 million at the time. And proving that a monitoring mission yields results is very difficult. How do you present that? How do you make clear to participating states that the presence alone is a deterrent that can help to calm down the situation? The absence of conflict is very difficult to prove, and link it to your presence even more difficult. And this I have mentioned several times. The mandate itself is also a challenge because it doesn't refer to what we do now. So what is meant to be doing in 2014, we're using the mandate, which hasn't changed, but in another way. That also raises expectations on the ground. The mission itself is now actively engaged in monitoring this conflict, in monitoring the humanitarian situation, just to mention one example, but we don't deliver humanitarian aid. Our monitors don't repair schools or bring medicines to hospitals, but the expectation raises, of course. Our monitors go into these villages with a notepad, take note of the damages of the ongoing fighting, disappear, the situation doesn't change. The civilian population on the ground has great difficulties in understanding. The sites themselves, without defining them here more clearly, again, the question of who are the parties to the conflict. There is a lack of accountability. Last year alone, we have registered over 401,000 ceasefire violations through the year. That's more than 1,000 a day on average. And this is just what we have been able to see. We have seen over 4,000 heavy weapons in areas where they should not be, on both sides of the contact line. Who has been holding them to account, to non-adherence to the promises? In other conflicts, for instance, you have a joint military commission that would adjudicate violations of an agreement. You don't have this in this specific conflict. The mission on a daily basis produces a catalogue of compliance and non-compliance with these agreements, but there is a gap there where accountability or a follow-up mechanism has not been put in place. Operational, lots of challenges there. The dimension of the area of operation is incredibly big. Ukraine is a very big country. To reach our theater in the eastern part, it takes days. To come to Donetsk and Luhansk, we have to travel by train to a closest train station, then travel onwards across the contact line in armored vehicles. You can't fly there any longer. You can't take out injured colleagues by air. There is a non-fly zone. You would have to take them across the contact line, far deep into government-controlled areas where helicopters can land. We have problems in our freedom of movement within areas not controlled by the government, but also controlled by the government. Last year, we had 25,000 patrols on the ground. Many of them are stopped either by minefields on the ground, they should not be there, which represents a violation of our mandate and the agreements, or then actively, more aggressively and more intimidating by the sites. And that mainly happens, this more active interference in areas beyond government control. Also, a dilemma is there, how do we report? How accurate do we want to report? The media cycle often is ahead of us. When there is an explosion in town, this morning, for instance, in Luhansk city, loud explosions heard in the center of town, the media immediately went public. Different stories appeared. The pressure is on the mission to come up with its report, to establish the fact as mandated, but it will take time. We have to dispatch a patrol there, we have to analyze the situation, the weapons used need to be looked at very closely, we have to talk to those that have witnessed the incident. The report then needs to be cleared within Kiev, within our participating states, see it in Vienna, translated and then published. It takes time to produce good quality report. We only report about facts. We don't speculate. So if we see a person that wears a camouflage type uniform and bears the insignia of a foreign country, we are not saying it is a citizen of the foreign country, but we say we have seen an armed man wearing a military type uniform with the insignia of that foreign country, because we don't conclude further. And that is also to mention that we always find ourselves in the difficult position of explaining that we are a monitoring mission, not an intelligence gathering operation. The area there in between is blurred, but we have to be very firm, or try to be at least very firm there, where we are clearly seen as monitors, that we see and that we report what we see and what we hear. Security, big problem, and those are known issues in an area of combat. Direct fire, indirect fire, mines, a big problem. We have lost one of our colleagues in April last year due to an anti-tank mine in areas beyond government control, the only fatality that we had to claim in these 4 years. The longer the conflict, the more of these hazards are on the ground, including unexploded ordnance. The beginning of the mission, we also had problems with the different groups that were fighting. Colleagues have been abducted in the beginning in 2014. That didn't happen since then. And the big question always there is how much risk we take in order to establish these facts. And that question is not only asked to us, but also to our participating states. How much risk is there? Is there a willingness for more risk to establish more facts? The toolbox, our monitors, of course, are our best asset there, but they are not recruited in the open market. They depend on the so-called secondment systems. Participating states put their candidates forward. And we have to find a balance between the backgrounds of these monitors, be they civilian or military. And then, of course, the dilemma we have there that a former UN Secretary General very well put in that quote that you see there, peacekeeping is, in fact, not a job for soldiers, but only soldiers can do it. And we, over time, had been considering technology as a complementary measure to monitors on the ground. We now use UAVs of different size. We use cameras on the ground. We have access to satellite imagery, and we're testing now as well acoustic sensors. How much of that technology should be deployed? What is the impact of the technology there? Does it make a difference to register 10,000 more violations in a week or not if there is no reaction from the sides to it? Difficult questions to answer, not only us, but also our participating states. And Tom, on this snowy picture there, and a link to our websites, this shall end my first session here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So thank you very much, Alexander. I'll just kick off with the first question, and then as we're going, if you'd like to join the queue, just put your hand up and I'll add you to the list, and we'll go from there. So one of the lessons that it felt like the international community, particularly those concerned with peacekeeping, learnt from the 1990s was the challenge of neutrality. And particularly the time in Yugoslavia was an area where intervening forces tried to keep strictly neutral, and there was a sense that that meant that atrocities like Srebrenica were not stopped. And that maybe in the 2000s there was a sense that we'd move towards partiality, so picking either winners or picking claims of justice and trying to intervene and impose those on the ground. Is there anything, lessons from those times that you're either relearning, or has the operating environment changed to mean that there are just different lessons that are appropriate for the context now?
An important question. The OSCE's mandate with this field operation is to monitor. The peacekeeping aspect to it is one of those aspects in expectation that were raised by us being present there. But the fact that the mission has a clear defined task in terms of establishing fact and facilitating dialogue doesn't necessarily mean that we are those peacekeepers that were in other conflicts there before. Of course, we have a mandate to stabilize and normalize through these two main tools of monitoring and reporting. And we have made it very clear that we are biased towards the sovereignty of Ukraine. There is no doubt that where the government has no control at the moment, there is Ukraine up to the border that it doesn't control at the moment, but that we are unbiased and neutral vis-à-vis the violations of the agreements, as they have both agreed to it. I think there we have taken that on board, and we make it very clear also with our interactions with those in effective control where the government has no control, that we fully understand what the sovereign country is that has that part or had that part under its control before.
Okay. And where do you find it hardest to defend? So you want to be neutral, obviously you're acting on that basis, but you're going to get charges that you're not neutral at times. Where's it hardest for you to defend against that claim?
This has different aspects. First of all, we are the messengers of very uncomfortable truths. As said, we are not repairing schools, so our reports are not nice to read. There is every day a catalogue of non-compliance that we report. So the sites are inclined to put the messenger in a negative light. So often that is a motivation, of course, in lots of the criticism that you read about us in the media. There is then also the composition of our teams. We have, out of the 57 participating states, some 45 are represented in that mission, including those from the United States. The biggest contingent is that together of the European Union, but also there are some 40 Russian monitors. And that on both sides gives cause for doubts and criticism. Our Russian monitors are criticized in areas under government control, and our American colleagues criticized in areas beyond government control. It is also often the wish of our readers that we apportion blame, that we solve the puzzle for them. Often that is not possible. As you know from your experience, that this is not a clinical affair. It's very difficult to objectively establish the fact who has fired the gun. You have an indication, you can put out a direction, you can figure out the type of weapon used, but to actually find the position, the weapon's position, and then apportion that to a side is very difficult. There are cases where it is very clear when we see weapons on the ground that are in violation of withdrawal lines. It's often beyond doubt who has control in the area. And as I said, this happened more than 4,000 times last year. When we are stopped in our tracks, which is also a violation, that also is not that difficult to follow up. But it isn't an easy job for both the management of the mission, the OSCE as such, and our monitors on the ground in particular. They have no easy task. As I've mentioned before, they go into these villages and can't directly help and are being seen by these civilians who have, for now the fourth winter, uninterrupted, had every day shelling in their villages, and these monitors come and go, and it doesn't change. So these monitors are on the blame front, if you wish, as well, and they are exposed to that on a daily basis.
And the kit is mainly Soviet era or Russian on both sides, presumably?
Yeah, the equipment broadly is on both sides the same. We have seen some more modern, sophisticated equipment in areas beyond government control. We've also clearly described that, photographed it. This is all public available. Again, we don't speculate where that come from if we haven't seen it coming from one or the other direction. But all of what we have seen and we have been able to identify is reported accordingly. That is the threshold in our reporting. There is no other censorship there. There is no hearsay in our reports unless there is some sort of triangulation that makes the fact an established fact.
Great. Thank you very much. Let's come over. So I'll come to at the back, please.
Hi there. Thank you very much for your presentation. Can I ask, in terms of setting the mission up, and then subsequently in terms of your processes and procedures, what lessons did you take forward from the OSCE Kosovo verification mission, which was the last large verification mission that the OSCE conducted?
In that mission, the OSCE's field operation left the theater before the eruption actually of the actual fighting. It disappeared from Kosovo. It left Kosovo on the eve of the fighting, the bombardment, and came then back as the OSCE mission to Kosovo later on. The verification task that it has been undertaking there, we have seen these files by setting up our own mission there, but it is significantly different because what the mission now in Ukraine does is follow up on an agreed agreement of withdrawing weapons on disengagement, whereas during the verification mission itself, these agreements weren't that clear where the verification could have made a difference.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Hello, thank you for coming. Very interesting presentation. My name is Chinara. I'm from Kyrgyz Republic. In 2010, my native town of Osh suffered violent interethnic clashes, and a lot of international organizations came to my town. And without going into details, I can say that in general, local population was very suspicious. They didn't want to share any information. They couldn't trust international organizations. And my question is basically about how did you establish your relationship with local community? Do you care about their opinion? Do you want them to trust you? Is it important in your work? And how do you manage to do it? Thank you.
Also very important, and probably one of the difficult tasks our monitors have, working there every day. Whenever you enter a village that is close to the contact line, then normally what happens is the first 15 minutes that you engage with civilians, there's a lot of frustration, understandable frustration that you encounter, often very loudly expressed, and often you're the first one that will be blamed of not having stopped it for the reasons I have explained before. That is not easy to take, and it's not easy to respond to that. And not every monitor is made for that, not least due to the language barrier. In order to really emotionally engage, you would need to be able to speak the language also fully. I think it is difficult to do that, but by repeated engagement with the civilian population on the ground, by trying to explain the very difficult mandate we have, and by trying to outline what we do with the information that we gather on the ground, that will bring some clarity to it. But I would agree with you, it probably would never be possible with a very complex political mandate like this mission have to fully explain to people that live in villages that have been shelled without end, have no gas, no water, no electricity. What they want is coming back to a normal life and have these services re-established. They don't really care of the permanent council and the participating states and the Minsk process. They want this to end, and the monitors can't end it. So there will be a never-ending dilemma there that is very difficult to deal with. Maybe on that point, the mission, unlike in Kosovo, has made very early on a decision in order to counter that, also lessons learned from that time, to publicly report. So all the reports we have in other field operations are diplomatic cables. They would not be made public. We publish them every day. These findings are being made public in Ukrainian, Russian, and English on a daily basis, with the exception of Sunday. And that should also help for the population to understand and use our reports also to understand the conflict better, because there at least they have a snapshot of the reality. We don't cover everything because we are prevented from it, but that helps also to generate better understanding, and should also be helpful to the media, who often also relies on hearsay and rumors and often is part of the equation itself.
Great, thank you. So, gentleman in front. Sorry, just gentleman over here, and then we'll come to you. Yep.
Thank you. What is your assessment of the Russian involvement in the conflict? So you said you try not to speculate, just describe the facts. And based on that, what can you tell us about Russian involvement?
Well, based on our observation, that question cannot be answered with a yes or no. First of all, the Russian Federation is a participating state to the OSCE and has, with its consensus vote, put this observation mission on the ground, so it supports it politically. The Russian Federation is also part of the Normandy 4 format, of the Trilateral Contact Group format, and contributes to all of these, including to our mission. We have very long made clear in our reports of what facts we have been able to establish on the ground, but it's then up to the readers of our reports to conclude and use these observations for their own decision-making basis. But it would not be helpful, we understand, be it with regard to the question you ask, or for any portion of blame question, if we would start pointing the finger, because that will put us to one side on very unsecure ground, very thin ice, and it must make us not a credible go-between and not one that can deliver objective information. What we hope to do is a contribution to objective discussions. So if the participants in Minsk meet and there is a question about tanks too close to the contact line, the debate should not be how many were on the sites, because that you can find in our reports. The debate then should be based on our reports and find solutions how to remove those tanks beyond that 15-kilometer line. And that is why, as much as there is a wish that we point fingers in one or the other direction, that we are not doing this, and not because we don't like to do it, but because we think we would not be helpful to the process. And I know that leads to great frustration as well, and it leads to criticism on both sides, which somehow indicates to us that we're doing it right, because if it would be just on one side, probably then we would not have done it properly.
So you may well wish not to comment, but I take it that if the contact line, as it currently is, solidifies so that the end state is in 15 years, that's a de facto border, that would effectively be a win in strategic terms for Russia. And so there is an interest in a kind of stabilization at that point. Should we move on to the next question?
Well, first of all, if I may comment on the contact line itself, it's very important to recognize that the line was drawn artificially. Yeah. If you are in eastern Ukraine, you don't see that line on the ground. There is no natural line that could be followed, nor was there a line that would divide groups on one or the other side. The fact that up to 40,000 Ukrainians still cross that contact line every day, it's quite a staggering number, tells that people do not accept this line as it is now. And I think the fact that they have endured now 4 winters in this conflict without a single day, with absolute silence, but still cross that line and don't accept it, I think that clearly demonstrates that the people on the ground do not accept this line.
Yeah, and we do have examples in history of lines of conflict that can endure for a very long time. So is it Abkhazia I'm thinking of? Someone correct me? Yeah, anyway. Great, thank you.
It probably overlaps a little bit, but can you tell us a bit more about the obstruction that you encounter on the ground? I mean, who obstructs you and in what way, and at what level are the decisions made? Is it just some sort of local soldiers who are going to decide you're not going there, or is it these are things higher up? And are the areas where your operations are obstructed more or less permanent or static, or do you go somewhere and find suddenly that you're obstructed here but not there, and so on, you know? And perhaps a sort of secondary part of that, when you write your reports, you're representing 57 countries. Do you have to kind of negotiate your reports, or do you run into trouble with members saying, hey, you can't say that, or you can't say that, or something? Or how do you write a report representing 15, some of them in considerable conflict? Thank you.
Maybe first answering your second question. We write very carefully without distorting the reality on the ground. So if you see the wordings that we use in our reports, make it very clear of some of what I have mentioned before. We refer, for instance, to areas in plural, not controlled by the government, or by controlled, and then comes a term in quotation marks. We don't refer to those in effective control in areas beyond government to participants or representatives. They are members to structure to represent more of the group structure rather than anything more recognized. So we're very careful in choosing our words, but not offending anyone, including those in effective control at the same time, because they are part of the equation which you need to deal with in the end. But it reflects a reality on the ground, and it reflects also the agreements that have been reached. The obstructions on the ground, there's 2 broad categories. One is the passive ones caused by minefields and other obstacles where we can't get forward. And this happens on equal measures on both sides. So there are bridges that are blocked by mines. There are areas where the roads have been blown up, could be repaired, where we can't go forward. All of that represents also a violation of our freedom of movement. And by the way, the sides have agreed in Minsk to enable the mission to effective monitoring So any of that, of course, is a violation of their agreements too, because it is not allowing effective monitoring. And then there are the more active interference in our work, where you have a guard pointing the gun at you, the guard saying you don't go forward here, or then in the more serious cases, opening fire nearby us, so outgoing fire near us, often then, of course, in the expectation that the other side will not return fire because they know that we are there, and therefore use that as a reassurance that counterfire will not immediately start it, or then direct fire at us, which also happened, but it's not the norm, or at our assets. So very often when you read our reports, you can see that our UAVs have been shot at, they've been interfered electronically through jamming equipment, and otherwise. These are the type of restrictions that are there. And then I have to add, to make the picture complete, there are, of course, self-imposed restrictions. So some of the mitigation measures that we apply in our patrolling is not necessarily imposed on us directly, indirectly, because our assessment of the situation dictates then how far we can go. All of these restrictions, in line with the transparency that I've mentioned before, are also reported at the bottom of our daily reports. You find these restrictions there, so it makes clear as to where we are and where we are not. And we always say that we only see a fraction of the reality. And to conclude here, the only reason why the sites would stop us in doing what we are mandated to do is that they don't want us to report of what we would see, because they know we would do so publicly, which again then would result, of course, in very uncomfortable reading for the respective sites.
Great, so we just got a lady in the black top, just in the centre there.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a little bit about, if you could say something about the difficulty of identifying the parties to the conflict, because on neither side, although we're talking about single coherent actors here, on the Ukrainian side I was particularly thinking about difficulty of lines of subordination with volunteer battalions, the Ukrainian army, on the other side with LNR, DNR, but also various so-called what they call immediate tourists that may also be operable in the region. So if you could perhaps reflect on how that affects, that particular complication affects the monitoring mission's effectiveness.
As a monitor, the definition of the sites not directly influences the work, because the ceasefire violations at the contact line on either side will be reflected as a fact on the ground, regardless of what the definition of the conflict is and what the definition of the parties to the conflict are. Of course, when it then comes to remedy them, it becomes a bit more difficult, and conducting dialogue on the ground on these subject matters becomes also difficult. We often, just to give you a practical example, try to facilitate localized windows of silence, we call them. This is a sub-issue of the ceasefire in areas where, for instance, there is a damage to infrastructure, to a gas pipeline that leads across the line, or where the wounded or dead need to be evacuated. That requires, of course, a coordination between the sites that has previously been done by the Joint Center of Control and Coordination to some degree, but we, having monitors on both sides of the contact line, have been able to facilitate that. Now, not all of the stakeholders, not calling them parties or sides, but all the stakeholders are able or willing to talk to one another for obvious reasons. But there the mission actually plays a role to bridge that gap and can facilitate the dialogue across the contact line through its own operation, which then helps in these very practical examples to facilitate an understanding on both sides without that any of the stakeholders directly would communicate with one another. I know this was a bit cryptic, but...
Okay, great. So lady in the red jacket, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the fascinating talk. As you know, there's been a long debate over the last 20 years or so about the optimum role of international organizations in peace monitoring or peacekeeping, peace enforcement, and so on. And your own mandate is, of course, set by a political negotiation rather than by a technical discussion. You mentioned the difficulty of quantifying the impact that your mandate is having, and I wondered if you could talk a bit about how you do quantify that impact, and whether leaving aside the political difficulties, whether there are any changes that you would like to see to the mandate that would actually increase the impact that you're able to have on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Our mandate is formulated very broad. So all that you see now in front of you or behind me here is done based on that mandate that was not meant to do what is being done at the moment with the mandate. Learning from the past as well, tweaking with the mandate as a practical approach would maybe bear more risks than advantages if we would like to change it, because most likely some of the aspects we do in our mandate and now is helpful to the conflict might not be liked by one or the other participating state, and opening that Pandora box would most likely lead to a curtailment of the mandate to the degree that it would then not any longer be what it is now. Now, being very vague bears also risks, of course, because you never know whether you would still be with the range of interpretation of all 57 participating states or not in doing what you do on the ground. If we facilitate the repair works, for instance, that we put under the broad umbrella under the fifth mandate point, which is we are to facilitate dialogue on the ground to normalize the situation. That is what the mandate says, but what we then do on the ground is actually directly assisting humanitarian work without conducting the work itself. And this is also, I think, where we can measure the impact of it. Some of these very concrete results that are often, sadly, only symptom treatment, because often when there is achievement in short-term normalization, it often then ends up in being engulfed in fighting again because the root causes itself are not being treated. So often the positions are located around critical infrastructure, pumping stations, for instance. The line that supplies the pumping station with electricity gets damaged. The local window of silence is established, the line gets repaired, the mission goes away with its patrols. The positions are still in the vicinity of that pumping station. The fighting erupts and the electricity line gets damaged again. So that is of course, the other side of that medal. The deterrence effect that I think I've also mentioned there can also be measured, but it's very difficult because you don't know if it's your presence or if there are other factors that may make a change in the number of ceasefire violations. It's a 500-kilometer long line, so it's very difficult to measure whether your presence as such has made a difference or not, or actually whether your presence actually fuels the continuation of the conflict. That's a question I've also implied that in the challenges that comes up on and on again. Are our static positions along that contact line actually helpful to resolving it, or does it actually cement something that that idea of the sovereign state would not be compatible with?
And can I just follow up on that as well? So if you had a mission twice the size, do you think that would be materially significant in terms of the outcomes that the OSCE could achieve, the monitoring mission?
It would certainly produce more observations, more facts. So instead of the 400,000, maybe we would have 800,000 the next year. But the question remains then, what is being done with that result? Because that is a missing piece, the follow-up action to the observed fact on the ground. It should feed in some sort of mechanism where then those violations can be channeled and brought to some resolution, that weapons that are in place where they shouldn't be are being removed and verified as being removed, that ceasefire violations from certain positions that are so too close are being remedied to take away the position from one another. These are the concrete results and mechanisms to achieve these results that are missing. So yes, it would produce more, but I would argue it would not necessarily do more to solve or address the root causes itself, because for that other means are needed, including political means to deal with it. And if you have seen the graph that I've shown you, it made it very clear to us that the sides have it in their hands completely to control the fighting. It's not something that is emotionally driven at the moment by a group dynamic underlying this conflict, which you can't control. When the decision is taken far away in Minsk, in the Belarusian capital, in Hotel President, where these discussions are taking place. In a warm room, these participants decide to recommit to the ceasefire. Overnight, within a few hours, you have 4-digit numbers before, heavy use of artillery, and then it drops to almost zero, all along the 500-kilometer long line. And that, of course, clearly demonstrates that political will is also needed there, apart from the mechanism to encourage that will. I think that should not be overseen, that more monitoring not necessarily means more implementation of the agreements.
Yeah, great, that's very helpful. So we've got a gentleman at the front here. And maybe just take two questions at the same time. So I think, did you also have a question as well? Yeah. So we'll just take these two first. And then we'll go.
You mentioned this quote that peacekeeping is not a job for soldiers, but only soldiers can do it. How do you meet that challenge?
Thank you. I'm an MMPP student here in BSG, and my question is, under the mandate, you're supposed to engage with the local authorities as well, and I wonder how the cooperation and partnership went so far, and whether it changed in this 4 years' time, as you mentioned this political interest just before in the question.
Well, first, the question on the UN Secretary General's statement there. Well, if I could resolve it, then we probably would be further in delivering at the contact line. But what we do, of course, is consulting those with military background, because there are clear military technical aspects of this that civilians can't solve. You can't take a doctor and ask them to define, or ask the doctors to define the caliber and the withdrawal distance the caliber requires. So you would need to have someone with a military background to define that. But equally, you don't need a former military, or you can't really define with a former military what sort of interaction with the media you need to design on the ground, or how specific issues on the softer side of the spectrum that we monitor should be monitored, and what tools should be needed. So I think the short answer is we try to be very careful in seeing who we get on board to find a good mixture between that civilian background and the military background that we can draw from both experiences. But it isn't easy to run a civilian operation in a military environment. This is very incompatible in many ways. It is possible in the short term to restrict our civilian employees' life after work, for instance. It's possible to do that in a month, 2 months, 2 months, 3 months, but if it goes longer, and we are now in the 4th year doing that, bears a lot of risks and concerns that trigger internal issues that, of course, come on top of all the other concerns that we are exposed to in the outside world. The interactions with the civilian population, in particular, those who have effective control, that is what you mean in areas beyond government control. Do you understand the question correct?
No, I meant various government institutions and agencies that you need to engage with, whether their pattern of behavior have changed during these 4 years under Poroshenko's administration. Did you notice any changes that have been helpful, or on the contrary challenging for reporting, monitoring, and delivering certain goals under your mandate?
No, we have very good relation with our host country and contacts on a very regular daily basis. And I'm not just making diplomacy now. I think I've seen other missions before. We meet very regular with representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We're very close linked with the Defense Ministry and all the other agencies at Kiev level, but then also at ground level there. And I think there we also have a need for ourselves to maintain that contact very close. It is, of course, to come back to some of the questions we have heard before, when it then comes to the product of our work, not always easy, of course, for the host country also to read their non-compliance with the agreements that we report on a daily basis. Because these reports, as mentioned, are public and available to everyone. But the constant debate with the host country, upon invitation we are in Ukraine, of course, helps to generate an understanding on both sides of what the concerns are. On the side of the government, but also on our side. On the other side, the relationship is a bit more difficult for many reasons, not to begin with that there are no structures as there are on the government side, of course, and we also not see these structures that are in effective control as equal to those on the government control, and we also hold the government, if you wish, to a higher standard, of course, than what these undefined structures are.
Great, that's excellent. So I think we had two questions in the middle, so in the blue jacket first, please.
Thank you for a good, interesting talk and answers. My question is, what is your view on the idea of having the UN troops put alongside your monitors to protect them, maybe to remove some restrictions where they can move or cannot move to some extent? And then the other question, would it help your mission or make it totally obsolete? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if you're all familiar with the only proposal made at the moment that by the Russian Federation submitted on the 5th of September to the Security Council. It has submitted a proposal for a protection force for the Special Monitoring Mission, and its operational paragraph number 6, I think, it lays out that this protection force should be light armed. Now, I have shown you before what the risks are that civilians, and our monitors are civilians too, are being exposed by most. These are minefields and the risk of being caught in indirect fire. Now, if these are the two risks that need to be mitigated by a light armed protection force, then probably the tool doesn't meet its end necessarily. But I think the debate as such as to whether an additional mechanism is needed on the ground is very helpful, because there are gaps in trying to manage this conflict, not least in terms of following up on the observations made by the sides. Ultimately, the risks the mission faces can only be best addressed by those who have control over them, which are those who have already agreed that these risks and these concerns exist in Minsk and have already agreed on measures how to tackle them.
Great, thank you. So just can I take a final survey of hands for anyone who'd like to join the queue or ask a question? So we'll just come here and then I'll ask a final one.
Thank you very much. I'm interested in the monitoring of the monitors, because I can just sense that there is a tendency from one party or another to gather information by the very process of monitoring itself. Have you got any comments on that?
You ask as cryptic as I answer. First of all, we are very clear that all what we see is to be reported. So there is no intelligence gathering on our side that we would not report. So there should be very little information that we gather that will not be made public anyway. And that helps us also to stay firmly on that side of being a monitoring operation rather than an intelligence gathering operation. There are a few exceptions to that. If we hear of individuals that complain of being subjected to maltreatment, and we do not want to publicly report because we know if we would, it could be traced back. These are some of the exceptions where there will not be an immediate public report on a finding that we have on the ground, but often results are then being followed up and through, and then after several days, results of that kind are being reported. The monitors also are subject to a code of conduct that they sign when they enter the mission, to which they also commit to some of the principles to the OSCE as an employer to them, and that they all sign and been explained at the beginning of the mission. And then finally, these monitors that we employ are all secondees. They are seconded by participating states who have put this mission on the ground. We, of course, are in the expectation that there is an interest of participating states to keep this operation efficient, because they would all have to justify the non-efficiency back to their capitals as the mission runs on taxpayers' money.
concerned about the eagerness to get to some sites, so that your reporting is, I know it's going to be more or less instantaneous as a report, but I could just sense if there was some, shall we say, bias, might not even be known by the people who are signing it, but they have this bias, who want to get to a site and report favourably one way or the other.
Yes.
So
No.
just a thought.
You're right, of course. These reports are compiled by humans, not by robots. Yeah. So, I mean, it's inherent that you look at a certain situation with your own perspective that you come to the mission. We have recognized that, and patrols are composed with different members on it. So there is not a Swiss patrol or a Russian patrol or a US patrol. They're always mixed on patrol. So if one patrol member says, I have seen 17 tanks in violation, and another says, I have seen none, then there needs to be a debate in that patrol. So it's little democracy there that happens while they're on patrol. And the reports are all agreed in the end by the patrol members themselves. So it is very difficult for one patrol member to manipulate, willingly or unwillingly, the results of an observation. Then there is this other inherent concern or danger of being not partial, of having enough monitors on both sides of the contact line. It is arguably, as I've mentioned before, less aggressive in its encounter in areas controlled by the government, so there's a natural move to do more patrols there because you can put them on the ground. You have less obstacles than where you are faced with more aggression. Also that we try to counter. We have teams on both sides of the contact line. They physically live there, so we have one of our biggest team in Donetsk city. They reside in Donetsk city itself and also patrol across the line from there so that they're not just stuck in their own side and start to adopt the view on the site they actually reside in. But I think after all, you're right, these reports are compiled, I think luckily, by humans, which also gives some sort of another aspect to it, rather than having a acoustic sensor calculating every shot that has been fired. Is something very unhuman to this, and I think the resolution of this and probably all the conflict can only be done by humans in the end, by talking and by having this engagement from human to human itself.
Great. Well, it's been a really fascinating exploration of some of the challenges you face, and I suppose one of the key takeaways I've taken from this discussion is that the solution to this crisis is multi-layered, and you're a part of that jigsaw, but a particularly vital and important part of it as a source of ground truth that everyone can agree on. So can we say thank you very much indeed to Alexander for sharing all this.